Every Star Wars fan knows Palpatine, the Emperor who ruled with fear and lightning. But what if I told you the real rulers of the galaxy were never in the Senate chamber at all? What if the true power rested in the slimy hands of a cartel that never needed a Death Star to enforce their will? The Hutts were the ultimate survivors, thriving in the shadows while republics and empires came and went. They didn't care about politics, they cared about credits, and credits last a whole lot longer than loyalty to a flag. That's why while Palpatine plotted in secret, the Hutts ruled openly and dared anyone to stop them. And here's the dirty secret nobody wants to admit. The Jedi let it happen. They could have stormed Nar Shaddaa, ended slavery on Tatooine, or crushed the spice trade, but instead they looked away, because fighting the Hutts meant starting a war they couldn't win. So they let corruption become part of the galactic DNA. Jabba the Hutt wasn't just a gangster, he was a king, with armies of bounty hunters and smugglers under his command. Nar Shaddaa wasn't just a moon, it was the true capital of the underworld, where even the Empire tread lightly. The Hutts thrived by doing what Palpatine never could, making themselves essential to the galaxy's survival. And when you look at the big picture, it's hard not to wonder if the Hutts were the smartest players of them all. Empires fall, Sith die, republics rot away, but the Hutts just keep counting credits and tightening their grip. They don't win battles, they win centuries, and that makes them the most dangerous power in Star Wars. In this video, we're breaking down how the Hutts quietly controlled the galaxy, why even Palpatine couldn't crush them, and how their slimy empire of crime outlasted the greatest governments the galaxy ever saw. When people think about galactic power in Star Wars, their minds jump straight to Palpatine sitting on his throne, or Vader looming over terrified admirals. But the real story of control starts far from Coruscant, in the murky underworld of Hutt space. The Hutts were never interested in Senate seats or waving lightsabers. They were interested in power that lasted no matter who wore the crown, and that power came through money, blackmail, and the kind of alliances you only make with a blaster pressed to someone's back. The Hutt cartel wasn't just a criminal syndicate, it was a parallel government that stretched across entire sectors, running spice routes, controlling trade hubs, and owning everything from gambling dens to slave markets. Their base on Nal Hutta was less a homeworld and more a fortress, with Nar Shaddaa, the smuggler's moon, serving as a capital city of crime where anything could be bought, sold, or stolen. You could call the Empire powerful, but they still had to negotiate with the Hutts because stormtroopers cannot occupy every cantina and back alley in the Outer Rim. The Republic had tried for centuries to curb Hutt influence, but the Jedi rarely got involved directly, and that was not by accident. The Order knew that a war against the Hutts would pull them into a quagmire they could never win, draining resources and causing political chaos. So instead, the Republic tolerated the Hutts, made deals with them, and pretended not to notice when they openly ran slavery empires in a galaxy that supposedly outlawed it. And that's the key difference. Palpatine had to keep up appearances, hiding his Sith identity and selling the illusion of democracy. The Hutts didn't care about illusions, they thrived in plain sight, knowing no one had the appetite to take them on directly. Even Palpatine's grand strategy couldn't fully eliminate them because their power wasn't centralized, it was distributed, and every gangster with a palace, from Gardulla to Jabba, could operate like a king. Think about Tatooine, a backwater dust ball the Republic barely acknowledged. Who owned it? The Hutts. Not Palpatine, not the Senate, not the Jedi. The Republic flag didn't fly there, but Jabba's did. That says everything about how deeply the Hutts embedded themselves into the galactic framework, and how little official governments could actually touch them. Now humour me with this thought. If the Hutts had shown up at the Senate chamber and said, "We run half your trade routes, and all your senators gamble with our money," they would have been laughed out. But behind closed doors, everyone knew it was true, and the Hutts didn't need validation from Coruscant to know they were winning. This was not a power measured in star destroyers or votes, but in credits, leverage, and fear. And unlike the Jedi who preached ideals they couldn't uphold, the Hutts didn't even bother with hypocrisy. Their brutality was their brand, their corruption was their currency, and everyone, from smugglers to senators, played their game whether they liked it or not. It's ironic that we call Palpatine the master manipulator, when in reality, the Hutts perfected that art long before him. They didn't need to hide behind a Senate chair because they owned half the people sitting in it. They didn't need to dominate the galaxy with stormtroopers because smugglers, bounty hunters, and traders bent the knee every time they wanted to get paid. So when people ask who really controlled the galaxy, the answer is more complicated than the Emperor. Because the Hutts proved that while Palpatine could rule through fear, they could rule through necessity. You can fight an empire, but you can't fight the fact that everyone needs the black market, and that's where the Hutts thrived. And it's in that shadow empire where their real genius lies, because even when empires fall and republics collapse, the Hutts never lose their throne of slime and credits. They outlasted every government, not because they were stronger, but because they were untouchable. If you want to see Hutt power in action, just look at Jabba the Hutt. People remember him as a grotesque slug lounging in his palace, but that image undersells his influence. Jabba was essentially a king on Tatooine, with armies of mercenaries, networks of smugglers, and even bounty hunters like Boba Fett on his payroll. And the fact that Luke Skywalker had to risk everything just to pull Han out of Jabba's clutches shows how untouchable the Hutts really were. Nar Shaddaa tells the same story on a larger scale. This moon wasn't just a den of scum and villainy, it was an entire ecosystem of Hutt control. Smuggling operations, spice trade, gambling empires, all under the cartel's thumb. Even the Empire had to tread carefully because cracking down too hard would choke off the very black market that kept their war machine supplied with raw materials and under-the-table resources. Here's the irony. Palpatine preached order, but his empire relied heavily on chaos, and the Hutts were chaos incarnate. By letting the Hutts operate, the empire got plausible deniability. They didn't have to dirty their hands with spice smuggling or slavery, they let Jabba do it, then pretended to be disgusted when caught. It was the ultimate scam, and both sides benefited. And the Jedi? Let's be honest, they looked the other way far too often. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan didn't stop the slavery on Tatooine, Yoda never marched on Nal Hutta, and the Orders Code conveniently skipped past the moral nightmare of letting Hutts sell children into chains. That silence wasn't an accident. It was survival, because challenging the Hutts meant starting a war the Republic could not win. The Clone Wars highlighted this perfectly. The Republic needed the Hutts' hyperspace routes to move fleets across the galaxy, which meant even Yoda was forced into diplomatic smiles with crime lords he would normally condemn. The Hutts leveraged that desperation brilliantly, playing both sides while ensuring that no matter who won the war, their trade routes and profits remained protected. And when the dust cleared and the Empire rose, nothing really changed. Jabba still threw parties in his palace, Nar Shaddaa still lit up with neon corruption, and the black market still fueled galactic trade. Palpatine could destroy the Jedi and reshape the Senate. But he couldn't make Han Solo stop smuggling spice, and he couldn't make Jabba bow down to the throne. Think about it. Luke, Leia, and Han didn't fight Jabba because he was a small-time gangster. They fought him because he was too big to ignore, too dangerous to leave alive. And yet Jabba's death didn't end Hutt power, it just created a vacuum for other Hutts to fill. That's the genius of their system. It wasn't dependent on one leader, it was a cartel. The Hutts thrived by never putting all their eggs in one slimy basket. They had redundancy built into their empire, so even when one slug got strangled by a chain-wielding princess, the machine kept rolling. The empire collapsed after one man fell, but the Hutts just shrugged and kept counting credits. So when we hold up Palpatine as the ultimate symbol of corruption, we're missing the bigger picture. He needed armies, superweapons, and fear to stay in power. The Hutts needed none of that. Just spice, credits, and the knowledge that everyone, from senators to smugglers, eventually has to come crawling to them. Here's the real kicker. The Hutts survived longer than the Republic, longer than the Empire, and even managed to stay relevant under the New Republic. How? Because they built their empire on something no Jedi or Sith could destroy. Human nature. As long as greed, desperation, and corruption exist, the Hutts have customers. Their system was decentralized, almost impossible to topple with one strike. You can blow up the Death Star and kill the Emperor, but you can't blow up crime itself. Every time a Hutt cartel lord falls, two more rise because their model feeds on demand, not ideology. That's why their power doesn't collapse with the fall of a single palace. It regenerates like a hydra. Even the Sith understood this problem. Palpatine could control the Senate, he could build fleets, he could crush Jedi, but he couldn't erase the fact that people wanted spice, credits, and freedom from laws. The Hutts didn't offer justice or order, they offered opportunity, and that's something no empire could ever replace. Look at how the galaxy changes across the timeline. Republic falls, Empire falls, First Order rises and falls. Through it all, the Hutts remain. That's not luck. That's strategy. They never tied their survival to one ideology, one leader, or one planet. They tied it to the universal truth that people will always pay for what they shouldn't have. Even heroes couldn't escape their influence. Han Solo smuggled spice, Anakin grew up in Hutt-controlled slavery, and Leia's rebellion still had to pass through smugglers and bounty hunters funded by Hutt credits. Every generation had to deal with them, and every generation failed to get rid of them completely. The irony is that the Hutts had more stability than any galactic government. Republics collapse under corruption, empires fall to rebellion, Sith fall to betrayal. But the Hutts thrive on corruption, rebellion, and betrayal. What destroys others only strengthens them. That's why they outlasted everyone else. And maybe that's the most uncomfortable truth in all of Star Wars. We can cheer when Luke destroys the Death Star, or when Rey defeats Palpatine, but none of those victories erase the reality that Hutts are still out there, laughing from their palaces while the galaxy congratulates itself. The cycle of power never ends because the Hutts aren't part of it, they're above it. You could even argue that the Hutts, not the Sith, are the true constants of the Star Wars universe. Their power doesn't depend on the Force, it depends on greed, and greed has a longer lifespan than any Jedi prophecy. That's why even centuries later, legends still whisper about the Hutts running spice routes, while governments fall apart. So the next time someone tells you Palpatine controlled the galaxy, ask them who really had the last laugh. Because while the Emperor went down a reactor shaft twice, the Hutts kept the lights on at Nar Shaddaa and kept the spice flowing. That's not just survival, that's dominance. And maybe the scariest part is realizing that in Star Wars, and in real life, it's often the people who never sit on a throne who control the galaxy the most.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.